Last summer, it was forest fires near the Arctic Circle. Now it's a freak June heat wave that has Europe and France's southern Provence region braced for a possible 45 degrees Celsius Thursday or Friday. The previous record from 2003 came in August. Why June? What's going on? Paris slapping a first ever ban on gas guzzlers because of an ozone alert triggered by the heat. Big public transport designs are in the work here in the French capital. They're due for completion in time for the 2024 Olympics. At the same time, scientists warn of too much hot air from politicians. Yes, while EU leaders talk of vows to go carbon neutral by 2050, it's right now that France is failing to meet its own CO2 targets. Our panel reacts to a report out this Wednesday that says we seriously need to cut our cars and drafty homes addiction. That's drafty homes that let all the energy escape. Can the government get it right? Much tougher regulation is needed. But don't forget that it was a carbon tax that sparked the Yellow Vests movement. How to go much faster, to be much tougher when it comes to energy transition without punishing the little guy. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, as Europe sizzles and France misses its climate targets, what to do with us. Anne Giraud, she's the executive director of the Paris Climate Agency. Thank you for being with us.
Hello.
I want to thank as well Nicolas Méan of the Government Advisory Board France Stratégie.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining us. You've just co-authored a report on cars, which we'll talk about perhaps in a little bit. He is a journalist come automotive consultant. Laurent Meillot is with us as well.
Good evening.
Welcome to the show. And from Brussels, Mariangiola Fabri, head of the research at Buildings Performance Institute Europe, a think tank. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. 40 degrees registered this Wednesday near Aix-en-Provence. That's in the south of France. If you travel north to the Alps from there, the locals will tell you it's no surprise. Sam Bradpeace explains.
The biggest glacier in the southern Alps is disappearing. The Massif des Écrins is 5 kilometers long and has been studied by glaciologists seeking to gain an insight into our warming world. The statistics for melt on this glacier are shocking. Between 2014 and 2018, increased temperatures have led the glacier to lose 5 meters of thickness, the equivalent of 7,000 Olympic swimming pools in terms of ice melt. Locals have seen these transformations under their eyes.
All the snow there in front of you will no longer be there in August. But 10 years ago, there was endless snow. The glacier is retreating at an incredible pace. For example, in 2000, the glacier came up to here.
By the end of the century, this mighty glacier could be gone completely.
And Giraud, everyone's wondering why. I mean, because, yeah, we have heat waves in the summertime. It's normal. But in June, and
It's not so astonishing to have this heat wave in June. We have data from the last 5 or 6 years, and what we can show that we have these heat waves starting from June up to September. So before it was August, but now in the next 5 to 6 years we show these 8 waves very in June, September, so it means a lot of problems because people are still working, pupils are still in school, so it means that for the cities the situation could be very dangerous. The good news is that we are ready to face these heat waves in Paris.
how are we ready in Paris?
We are ready because we learned a lot from the previous years. We learned a lot from the situation in 2003.
Yeah, just to explain to our viewers, in 2003, people were haunted by the fact that it was August, there was a big heat wave, and a lot of people who live alone died.
Died, and nobody knew about heat waves. It was everybody was surprised, so we were not prepared to that, not organized. But starting from the lessons from this period, we have organized the city in different ways. And also it is important to see that Last year we had almost 80 days of heat waves last year. So from that we happened to understand and we prepare the city in 3 different ways: where to go, what to do, and how to take care of the people, elderly, young people. This is what we have prepared. For example, you know that in Paris, if you want to be in a place, fresh area, you can go in cool places. You can go in cool places with cool streets to go there. You can go in parks which are open. You have many things that you can do in order to be protected.
All right, yeah, a lot of precautions being taken, a bit of grumbling at times, particularly for parents who planned vacations but had to postpone them because their kids were passing the high school entrance exam. Now, France may be vocal when it comes to pushing the Paris Climate Change Agreement, but that report that we mentioned at the outset, showing that the country is missing its own climate change targets, that's according to a panel established in the wake of the Yellow Vest movement. Shirley Sitbon has more.
The trend is better than before. France has cut down its greenhouse gas emissions, but only by 1.1%, half its target. The reasons behind this disappointing result? Policies are reportedly too weak. Authorities have been unable to make transportation greener, for example. Transportation accounts for about 30% of emissions. Building heating represents about 20%. France needs to better isolate its homes to limit thermal losses. The country also needs to cut emissions due to farming. The head of the High Council for Climate, the watchdog created by Emmanuel Macron, says the current heat wave is directly linked to pollution and climate change.
People are starting to see for themselves what it means to have climate change. If you're out in Paris today, you can actually realize firsthand what climate change means. And these projections are there to stay unless we really cut our emissions to zero.
And there is much to do. Imposing a tax on car pollution, for example, suspending all financial aid for fossil fuels. Authorities will also have to tackle other factors that are not even taken into account in the report, like exports, the transport of goods across the globe. They're believed to be the cause of some 60% of all emissions.
Before we delve into the specifics of that report, let's pick up on that last point because, it's true when you're calculating whether or not you're making or missing your emissions targets, Nicolas Meillan, you may be cleaner, but perhaps you're outsourcing to another country what you do that's dirty.
Yeah, exactly. We are actually very good at this. If you look at our emission in 1990, I think they decreased by 15%, whatever happened in France. But then if you include our importation and exclude our exportation, then the picture is slightly different because it increased by 20%. Today, when we look at the carbon footprint of the French, more than half of it is imports. And we were producing goods in France with decarbonized electricity. And now we're producing these goods in Eastern Europe or in China, importing it. And so globally, we made the things worse.
All right. Laurent Meyer, one statistic in there that was quite surprising. There was this target that 9% of vehicles in France by this point would be either hybrids or electric, and instead it's 2%. Are you surprised?
It's within 2%, that's right. For almost 10 years from now, we have some electric vehicles on the market. We only have 200,000 cars, as you have overall 40 million cars in the whole country. So it's really nothing compared to...
Are you surprised?
Not so much, because it will be a very long transition for decades, to be honest. I can understand the challenge, I can understand the ambitious goal from the government, but you have to convince the customers, because if the customers are not ready or open-minded to buy the cars they want, and they need to be reassured about the charging points, about the time it's going to take to refill the battery and so on. So they need to learn, they need to drive, they need to discover. So it's not so surprising to say it's quite slow.
On that score, Nicolas Meillan, you agree?
Yeah, I mean, when you buy an electric car, it provides a lower service because first you need to have a parking space, you need to charge it, which you don't always have when you live in a city. And then if you want to travel for long distances, you have a more limited range with the car, you need to charge it. There is not that many charging points. And when you find one, it's going to take you much more time. So you have to pay more to get less. Obviously, there is something missing, and we will need to have more cars on the road from next year because there is an obligation for vehicle manufacturers, a limit on CO2 in 2021. And this is when they start to launch cars which are more affordable.
And your report says what on that score?
Well, what we say is that actually we are very far from reaching our objective on CO2 for transport. It's largest contribution in France, and 30%. In Europe, it's slightly less. And what we say is that emissions have only been decreasing by 10% in real life compared to 30% of what on the test. And there is only two ways to get there. The first way is to reduce the weight of the car. The car took 10 kilos per year over the last 50 years, plus 500 kilos. We need to decrease that. And
so don't concentrate so much on the type of fuel or a bit more on how heavy the car is.
Well, whatever the type of fuel, a lighter car will use less energy. And then when it's lighter, it's also easier to electrify it because then you need a lower size battery. But you need to do both. And if we don't do both, there was a report from an OECD organization saying the European Commission has a target of minus 60% on transport from 1990 levels. 20% you get it with business as usual. But if you want to get the other 40%, it's the weight decrease 20% and electrification 20%.
Marangelo Fabri, I know that cars are not your specialty, but something I want to pick up on what Nicolas Maillot said there, which is the fact that there still are these discrepancies on how you measure pollution, on how you measure energy efficiency between what's done in the lab and what actually happens in real life. Is it changing in Brussels?
Well, in Brussels, it can change up to a certain way when you refer to the European Union. I think the changes have to come at member states level. It is slightly changing in the sense that there is an increased awareness of the fact that we don't have all the data that we need, that we don't measure them in the same way. So it's very difficult to compare them, and we need those comparisons for two reasons: one, to know where the European Union is going as a group, and also where the actions in terms of how we want to differentiate how member states implement some policies and some decisions to make sure that they can achieve these targets are actually done. We've always confronted with requests of comparison across member states on a number of things, and we rarely have all the data and the information to be able to provide a precise information. But I can say that there's been an increase in energy consumption in the building sector in the last 3 years, which is going against the direction that we should actually go. So we are concerned about this, but we are also trying to figure out why is that and how we can measure it properly.
All right. This report that was put out by the government, it's critical. It was put in place, the panel that put it out, in the wake of the Yellow Vests movement, and you could sense it was almost like there was a bit of embarrassment in the rapporteur's voice when she said, "Well, one of the things we might need is some kind of carbon tax." Remember, it was a carbon tax that sparked that Yellow Vest movement because people who live far from big cities are saying, "Hey, we're unfairly getting punished."
What has been said in this crisis was all right, but if we don't have any financial and taxes in order to help how we can retrofit in the building sector, as it has been said before, it will be very difficult to give a real price and to help the properties and the owners to retrofit building and to move from brown finance to green finance.
So what are the lessons you've learned? Because let's face it, NGO, your constituents, they're quote unquote the winners of globalization, the ones who don't need a car necessarily. So they'd be all for a carbon tax. Now, after the Yellow Vest movement, are you rethinking the way you look at this whole problem?
We are rethinking in two ways. The first way is we believe that it is very necessary to explain much more the reality of climate change, and there is a deficit in the citizen for the citizens to understand really the reality. With this situation, heat wave, maybe something will happen. So we need to better explain what is going on and what will arrive in the next years. And we have also to help the transformation in our cities, transport sector, building sector, urban planning, public spaces. This is all we have to do in the very next years.
Laurent Meillot, do you think the government gets it in terms of coming up with a fairer way of forcing people to act fast when it comes to reducing CO2?
They want to go fast, but once again, it's a question of price for the customer. I mean, you were referring to a Yellow Vest protest. There have been some incentives to convince them to change their cars. They didn't shift from thermal cars to electric. They have bought some more recent cars, but still thermal engine with less pollution, less consumption. But once again, it will take some time. So there's an obligation for the car makers because they have some numbers to respect. They have to sell some electric cars more and more. So all the French industry has agreed with the government. They have a plan for 5 years. But on the other hand, the government has to invest as well in charging points. So once again, it's a chicken and egg issue, and it's a question of confidence. The customers need to believe to change, I guess, their mobility. It won't be like that.
And can you make a fair carbon tax? Is it possible?
To be honest, I don't know if it's possible because once again, I think that people are protesting against taxes, so it needs to be intelligent. If you refer to Norway, which is the country where you can find most of electric cars, it was incentivized by the usage, by the use cases. So you can park for free, you can charge for free. If you make a mix of taxes but also some benefits, maybe you can balance and convince people.
Nicolas Méon, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think there's an elephant in the room when you come to carbon tax. It's called the plane. Plane is what French people use. The most used mean to go more than 100 kilometers. And there is no tax on plane. And the CO2 emissions are not counted either.
But there again, if you do, and we've been talking about flight shaming, as the Swedes call it, we've been talking about it, but if you do tax jet fuel, will that punish the poor as well? The rich will still take the plane.
No, because 25% of the French people take the plane. 75% of the poor don't take the plane. It's a rich thing to take the plane. So it has to be done at the European level. But the thing is, François de Rugy just said 2 weeks ago, the environment minister, I will not put a carbon tax on internal flights. And for me, it killed the carbon tax. If you don't tax the plane, you can't tax the other cars. It's not possible.
All right. When we come back, we're going to take a look at what the report says when it comes to housing, another big source of pollution. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate amid a freak June heat wave, which could set records on Thursday and Friday. A new report that shows France is failing to meet its climate change targets. What to do? Well, we're asking Anne Giraud, Executive Director of the Paris Climate Change Agency. Welcome back as well to automotive consultant Laurent Meillot. Nicolas Mélan, if the Government Advisory Board France Stratégie is with us, and from Brussels, Marangiola Fabri, Head of Research at the Buildings Performance Institute Europe think tank. Now, after a steady increase in pollution alert incidences, we've had a change here in Paris this time around. Before, when you had pollution alerts, it was alternate driving, whether or not you had an odd or an even numbered plate. Paris, for the first time, enforcing these new sticker restrictions on a scale of 1 to 5, categories 3, 4, and 5 for cars, trucks, and two-wheelers, forbidden from driving there. You see it inside the ring road that's in the suburbs of Paris, the A86, that outer ring road. And it's getting, after day one, mixed reviews.
I'm furious because, of course, if I had the money, I would go ahead and buy a new car, and I would be allowed to drive.
Well, I guess our boss is going to have to find a way to adapt to these new rules.
I think it's great the city is pushing for non-polluting, eco-friendly means of transportation.
Just full disclosure, that last that last person we heard from was in Marseille, where they're putting in place the same thing. But your thoughts on how it's gone day one, Laurent Maillot, here in Paris. Your thoughts on these new stickers. Is it a good idea?
Yes, it is. Definitely, you have some low emission zones in Europe, in many countries. So I think that it's relevant to authorize only the cleanest and more recent vehicles, and the other one stays in the garage. For big pollutions, I think it's very logical. So yes, definitely, the new law on mobilities in France will authorize some cities to do so. So you have Paris, you mentioned Marseille, but at least 50 cities in France are going to do that. So yes, I think it's a normal evolution.
All right. Angelo, you were mentioning before the break how the strategy for the city of Paris, well, actually, it's not just the city, right? It's the whole Paris region, goes beyond just restricting car traffic. There are all these metro lines being built. Yeah. Is it big infrastructure projects that are being favored first, and then things like bike lanes, which are cheap?
I think things are going together. We have to prepare new infrastructure. We have to think of mobility. The question is not cars. The question is how we can organize the mobility. What is the right mobility to the right need, and how this mobility can be organized in order to be carbon neutral or prevent pollution.
All right, a reaction from one viewer who's obviously a driver on the hashtag F24 debate. The car restrictions are a poor tax, and this penalty is keeping us from getting to work, to make money, to pay taxes to the stupid government.
If we don't give good signals, and if we don't explain what we are doing now, explain what is the situation, and we cannot stay at the same situation, we have to accelerate the energy transition. So this is a good signal, and I'm sorry if there is some...
Right. This master plan, by the way, it's called in French Le Grand Paris, the Greater Paris. And your thoughts on it, Nicolas Mélan? Is it being done? Is it the right way?
Well, just to answer on I'm not sure it's going to address many issues, because the key issues for the mobility is that people drive to work and back to work, and they are alone in their car. And now most of the time it's an SUV. And this is the problem. How do you address it? You do carpooling. Has it been done before in the world? Yes, for 50 years in the US, and it's very cheap. It's called a carpooling lane. So one thing that could be done when we have this pollution, for example, is say, you cannot drive yourself your car if you have 3, 4, 5. But if you go with somebody else in your car, then you can come to Paris. And that would be very wise, and that would not let all the poors and gilets jaunes on the side and prevent them from to go to work.
And Giraud, you agree?
Yes, of course.
There needs to be more carpooling?
Yeah, we need. And we are trying to organize this. This is
the biggest, honestly, this is the biggest way to reduce not only pollution, CO2 emission, and whenever it's possible, anybody that goes to work should try to carpool with somebody from his work, from somebody working next to it. And that's become very much feasible now because you have application on your smartphone that can help you find somebody.
All right, Marie-Joëlle Fabry, let me update you on a bit of French domestic politics the last few days. We have a bill that's sponsored by a member of Emmanuel Macron's party, which is calling for housing in France to be more energy efficient, to be up to norms by the year 2023, or else landlords can't rent out the apartment. And you have the government, which is having second thoughts. Even though the bill comes from a member of Macron's party, the government's saying, we already have a crunch when it comes to rental apartments. Won't this mean that there'll be even fewer places to rent on the market? Your thoughts?
Yes, I think you have to look at this from a slightly different perspective. The concerns of the government are fair, but also the proposition makes sense. And what I mean by this is, like, we need to create a system where there are incentives to renovate, but also where there are some sort of limitations on what one can do with a property if it is not properly renovated. And I'm not saying about. I'm not talking about.
Just to be clear for our viewers, what does making an apartment or a house more energy efficient entail? How expensive or how cheap is it?
Well, it really depends on the intervention that are needed, on the typology of building, how many people live in the building, how it is used. So there are a lot of factors. But usually, a good intervention, if the house is very drafty, is to make sure that it's properly insulated. And this has advantages not only in terms of energy consumption, but in terms of comfort, in terms of well-being, in terms of increasing indoor air quality, which are all a number of factors that are very important when it comes to our well-being and how we live in our buildings. We spend 90% of our time indoor in Europe, so we need to make sure that that time is spent in buildings that are properly insulated and there is good comfort level. When it comes to introducing an obligation of not being able to rent your property if it's not properly insulated, I think France, by the way, is not the first country that is introducing this. In the UK, they're also considering this. The Brussels region here in Belgium has announced something similar a couple of weeks ago. So I think there are really attempts to make sure that there are a series of measures where there is an incentive to renovate.
So put more
that being
incentives
said, we need to make sure that. Yes, but that being said, we need to make sure that these requirements to renovate or these incentives to renovate are actually matched by a proper financial plan, by a proper financial infrastructure. Whether it's a green loan, whether it's a state subsidy, whether it's a tax credit, there are many ways of doing this.
Yeah, except. Let me interrupt you here because what the statistics find is that those that have already done that renovation are the owners of social housing. It's the private sector, the profit-making sector, which has spent the least here in France on making homes more energy efficient. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me two things. That, of course, it's easier to intervene when there isn't a large profit at stake and when you can plan for a certain type of renovation and implement it with a bit of governmental support or public authority support. In terms of private investment, what we hear is that there is a lot of money available, but renovation is a difficult thing to do. It creates an hindrance to the building, to the tenants if the building is rent, to the owners if the building is occupied by its own owners. So there are a number of things that are not related to the technicalities of renovation, but are more psychology related to how difficult it is to accept to renovate and how to decide it.
And Giraud, for or against forcing landlords to take their property off the rental market if they don't do their energy transition?
I think it's a good signal that can be given to the market and to the owners. If we can give this signal that by a few years they will not be able to rent there. But we have to prepare those people. We have to help them to renovate their building. We have to help them to give them free advices, financial tools in order to prepare. If the obligation is by the year 2025, we have 5 years ahead, so it's not nothing. So if we give the good signal, the market could be prepared to that.
We said at the outset how in France, transport is the number one energy consumer, some might even argue energy waster. Housing, how much of a problem is it?
It's a large problem. If we are speaking in Paris itself, building renovation is a major problem because we have a lot of public transportation within Paris. So we have to renovate 1 million dwellings by the year 2050 in Paris. So it means that we have to accelerate by 10 to 15 times the rate of renovation, the actual rate of renovation. This is our main subject. So it means that we have a lot of things to do.
Your reaction, 1 million homes that need renovating. Oh, meu.
That's huge. That's
Yes, it is.
That's crazy numbers.
Are we putting too much of the onus on cars and on transport when we look at ways of meeting those climate change targets that we're not meeting?
That's right. The car is always pointed out when you talk about pollution and CO2. So that's right. You have the feeling that the car makers have to support all the efforts, and this is obviously what they're going to do. And they may pay some fines, as Nicolas referred earlier, because they have to respect very strict CO2 obligations. But you have to consider the whole picture. The car is not the only one responsible. Of course, I would include the planes. Don't forget the ships in Marseille. When you have huge boats, they pollute much more than dozens of hundreds of cars.
Yeah, those cruise ships that dock.
Absolutely, because they stay stationary and the engines are turning and they pollute very much. They send a lot of particles in the air.
All right, lots of reactions. Another one on the hashtag F24 debate. Another summer, more crazy heat waves, this time closing schools in Paris. We're seeing this is the new normal, which we're making for ourselves, says that viewer. And we're seeing more extreme weather. Scientists warn it'll be more heat in the summer, more cold in the winter. An alarming survey put out last year by the Paris-based International Energy Agency warns that most homes in hot countries have not yet purchased their very first air conditioner. You can see on that graph how that's all changing. Right now, 5% of homes in India have air conditioning. India, where they recently recorded 50 degrees Celsius. In fact, over the next 3 decades, the energy expended on cooling is expected to make up 37% of new electricity demand, according to the IEA. Nicolas Méon, it's the idea that we're going to see a lot more air conditioners, and there's this sort of vicious cycle, right? The more it gets hot, the more you buy an air conditioner. The more you buy an air conditioner, the more you burn fossil fuels and use energy. And
we obviously have an issue. And if we step back 1 second, since we signed this Accord de Paris in 2015, sorry, we've never increased that much CO2 emissions. Never, ever. So one could consider, was this agreement to increase CO2 emission or to decrease CO2 emission? I think this problem needs to be dealt with seriously. What does it mean? Carbon tax in Europe, with, as Emmanuel Macron mentioned already 3 times, to have a boundary tax on carbon. This is a real problem, and for the time being, each time we have a new agreement, we continue to increase our emission. This is not possible, and this has to be dealt with. And you mentioned the building, just to give you an example, an average building, 20,000 euro to renovate. 20,000. Who can pay 20,000? You get it back after 15 to 20 years, and by the time you're somewhere else. Nobody's going to pay for it. I offered a solution 10 years ago. I said, look, we need to take out some of the profit from the plus-value when you sell your flat.
The capital gains.
And you say, if your flat is a good performance, I take nothing. If it's not so good performance, 20%, and it's bad performance, 40%. And this can fuel this. You can get 10 billion euros every year to renovate 500,000 buildings. This is the target
And that's
since
not
10
being
years
proposed.
ago. Nobody wants to
Tax capital gains instead.
Nobody wants to do it. It's not possible in France.
That's why, if you allow me this joke, in cars you have air conditioning. You can find that sometimes in tramways or public transport. So I have received an email from a cab company saying you can ride for fresh because we have air conditioning in the car. So it was just to tell you that sometimes it's difficult to get rid of the conventional car because you have advantages you can find always in public transportation.
Among the reactions from viewers, Angelo, this one by Trewin. France is starting to close dozens of schools in response to the expected heat wave. The heat caused by climate change is going to force significant changes in the way our cities operate. They're woefully unprepared. Do you think the city of Paris, for instance, has to start considering air conditioning in schools?
Air conditioning in schools, no. But moving retrofitting schools and schools and the public spaces in the schools, there is a project name is Oasis Schools, and the objective of this project is to take out the asphalt in the public area of
in the
school,
courtyard.
In the courtyard, thank you, and to vegetalize this courtyard, and we are experimenting this on 3 schools. Next year, we'll be experimenting on 30 schools. And the idea is to, with this, to experiment and to deploy this in the next years in order to have places for children, cool, fresh, pleasant to live, and also to explain to the children how climate change, what is climate change, and how they can act in climate change. So this is already moving in Paris for schools.
All right, so less asphalt, less concrete in the schoolyard. Of course, there's also the question of, it's again looking at the rest of the planet. We're talking now here about things like beehive technology to cool places instead of using air conditioning. Is it feasible?
There is no choice. We have to make it feasible. We have all to be driving our forces, all forces on all sectors for the carbon neutrality. We have to accelerate. We have to think of all the different sectors all together, and we have to change our city. We have to adapt. We have to answer to crises like we have now this crisis, and we have to adapt our cities. And cities are already taking care of all these subjects, so we don't have any other solution. Otherwise, we will lose the control of the temperature in the planet.
All right, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights has warned this week of climate apartheid over the coming years. Peter Alston spoke to France 24.
Going to be forced to flee. They're going to be climate refugees. They won't be able to afford to change where they live. We are going to see a dramatic difference within societies in terms of the way that rich and poor experience climate change.
Marangiola Fabri, as we're speaking, there's this standoff taking place off Lampedusa with this migrant rescue ship, the Sea Watch, which European nations are refusing. Where you are people seeing this as a climate issue, or is it just a migration issue? It's not the same thing as the environment.
No, I think more and more people are actually connecting the two things. And I remember I started working on climate change about 16 years ago. That was one of the first forecasts that really struck my attention, how increase in temperature would lead to increased immigration waves. And we see it now, and we see how dangerous the situation is for the people who are really attempt to escape these countries. And I think that we will have to look at ways on how to really mitigate and adapt to climate change, even in view of increasing immigration waves. But if you allow me, I would like to go back to a point that was raised before about India.
Go ahead.
And their need for air conditioning.
Same electricity.
India is going to build 75% of its building stock in the next 50 years. So the solution is not to install air conditioning, but to build them properly to make sure that the need for this type of appliances and plug-in appliances is reduced as maximum. And this is true for also other countries. In Europe, we are facing a different issue. We have an old building stocks that needs to be renovated.
But in India, you can get it right at the outset. Marangiola Fabri, I want to thank you so much for joining us today from Brussels. I want to thank here in the studio Anne Giraud, Nicolas Meillon, and Laurent Maillot for being with us. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. Keeping cool is France 24's James Creedon.
Because we have air conditioning in the building, which is nice. So many headlines, Francois, in the last couple of days that are alarmist on the whole issue of climate change and the connected issues of pollution and whatnot. Just to quickly show some of them some of which you've been mentioning during the course of the show. G20 countries contradicting their pledge to minimise fossil fuel subsidies. That's the report that came out from the Overseas Development Institute, pointing that the UK and France, amongst others, were basically not matching up to their targets at all. The same data shows that France, which enshrined the climate and ecology emergency as part of draft legislation that could see the country agree to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, spent an average of $8.02 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies during the same period. So that, hot on the heels of the news that came out today, which has been widely reported as well in the international press, that France is failing to tackle a climate emergency, and that coming from an internal France's Independent Advisory Council. So really it's kind of hammering the message home, I think it's fair to say. Another headline, if I can find it, it of course was yesterday's court ruling here in France that the French state has responsibility. It's been essentially acknowledged that the state is culpable for failing to take the measures needed to reduce concentrations of certain polluting gases. This was a case in the Paris suburb of Montreuil, where people living near the Ring Road with health issues, bronchitis and whatnot, the court, without awarding financial damages, recognised the responsibility of the state, linking those health issues with pollution and the French state's responsibility to do something in that regard. So there's a lot of reaction across the board to all of these different stories. Just one thing worth pointing out, François Ruffin for the France Insoumise, a left-wing politician very critical of Emmanuel Macron's government. He did a little bit of sleuthing today at the Élysée Palace. Inside, he says, you have big speeches about the heat wave and the environment, but outside you see ministers' cars and with
the National Assembly.
That's right, at the National Assembly, rather, yes, with their engines ticking over. So he was trying to kind of say that they're being hypocrites, but using, I suppose, a bit of a gimmick in that regard. He was criticised for that by others, saying, Mr. Ruffin, you're on a slippery slope here. It's easy to blame motorists, but actually, as with these ministers and other motorists, a lot of the time they don't have a choice. They have to kind of, for now, the alternatives aren't there. When it comes to pollution and greenhouse gases, the real problems are elsewhere, and he has a chart indicating that it's not just cars. Cars aren't the only issue. In any case, what else do we have? We're kind of shooting around between different issues, Francois, but of course all of this, as you were mentioning, against the backdrop of this very intense heat wave that we're having right now. This is reminding us that in 2014, one TF1 weather presenter jokingly actually it was using projections for the weather forecast in 2050. Guess what? 2014, 2019, this is only 5 years ago.
This is tomorrow's forecast.
We're already there. Yeah. We've already reached
today we reached 40 down here, but otherwise, yeah.
So what we thought would be 2050, sorry, it's already in 2019. I'll just very quickly finish with this. 2 times as many heat waves in Europe between now and 2050. That is also Météo France projections, or predictions rather, that being reported today in the European scientists. So certainly it is quite alarming. That image of Scream, Munch's Scream, that was a real image of the weather map yesterday.
And that's yesterday. Tomorrow's supposed to be worse, yes. And Friday as well.
We're entitled to scream if we want.
James Creedon, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.